glad to introduce you Professor Marek Hrubec. He is director of the Center of Global Studies in the Institute of Philosophy in Prague. He also is the coordinator of the Global Conflicts, a research program called Global Conflicts and Local Interactions. So he will present the paper. Where is it? Imminence of limited nuclear war. Oh, very interesting topic.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your introduction. First of all, I would like to thank organizers of the conference, Alessandro Pinzani, Anita de Oliveira, and their colleagues from Florianopolis, and of course also from Porto Alegre and other places here in Brazil. Today I will talk about imminence of limited nuclear war, while usually I focus on social and political philosophy mainly, even if in cooperation with social sciences. Today I will focus more on political sociology, even if there will be also some parts of my paper focusing on social and political philosophy, because you know, I approach various problems from the point of view of critical theory, so I try to be interdisciplinary. Almost 30 years after the Cold War, the Trump administration has revitalized the intention to include nuclear weapons into its real military plans and to create a new arsenal of nuclear weapons for the new age of global capitalism. This could cause enormous direct ravages of war and ravage society. This threat may be bigger than in the Cold War era. During the Cold War, even if nuclear weapons were marginally considered possible weapons of war as a last resort, their main purpose was different. They served as a deterrent against one's enemies, while their fast use at the end of World War II at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was in fact a test of this kind of weapon of massive destruction. Since then, they have never been used. The USA and the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons under the mutual assured destruction doctrine in order to prevent war. And not only the superpowers, but also other nation states started to consider their nuclear weapons as deterrents. Because of potential mutual destruction, the use of nuclear weapons was regarded as thinking the unthinkable for a long time until now. Now we have entered a new epoch of military threats for society. For the first time in the human history, nuclear weapons are being considered as a real tool for various future armed conflicts. New US strategic documents, political statements, and corporate interests have confirmed a change which has been under preparation over the last few years. The purpose of this lecture is to offer a critical analysis of risks of nuclear war with its lethal consequences for civilians and societies and brutal violation of human rights. It can contribute to analysis of the complex issue of global interactions. I will deal with the difference between the strategy of global destructive war following classical application of standard nuclear weapons under the mutual assured destruction doctrine on the one side, and the new strategic plan of limited nuclear war without its global continuation on the other. The possibility of avoiding a planetary catastrophe is redeemed here by the real intention to make nuclear war, even if only on a limited scale. I will address this issue not as a technical security problem, but as a major social threat interconnected with the interests of specific groups of transnational capitalism in the current phase of technological development. In the first part of my lecture, I will address the contemporary impulses for critical theory of the risks of limited nuclear war and its consequences. I will explain the characteristics of the current nuclear threat for societies and the related problems of the new strategic documents of the US administration, particularly the National Security Strategy and Nuclear Posture Review. Then I will explain causes of this problem. In the second part of my lecture, I will explain the critique of technological reason or technological rationality. In the third part of my lecture, I will address an issue of action and partially conflicts of political, potentially democratic, corporate and technical military interest within transnational capitalism, which create the risks of limited nuclear war. So let's see the first part of my lecture focusing on the contemporary threats and the new strategic documents which are here. Soon after Barack Obama became US president in 2009, he gave a speech to the crowds in the front of Prague Castle in my home city. It was his first historical speech on foreign policy, defending a nuclear-free world. He pursued America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear powers, with nuclear weapons. The Nobel Prize Committee decided to award him the Nobel Peace Prize for his extraordinary efforts in international politics and stressed the special importance of his vision of a world without nuclear weapons. However, leaving aside saving the world from nuclear threat, he continued in wars. After the disillusionment of Obama's promises of nuclear disarmaments, the Nobel Prize Committee tried to contribute to denuclearization again. The Peace Prize 2017 was awarded to the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. These pragmatic efforts of the Nobel Prize Committee to award persons and organizations prizes for their expectations are surely worthy of recognition. However, they have missed the reality of the current endeavors of some groups who focus not primarily on large numbers and sizes of nuclear weapons, but on the contrary, on the usage of few small weapons. As I will explain, under Trump's administration, today's US approach attempts to revitalize the difference between conventional and nuclear weapons and between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons. Their argument is that small nuclear weapons and only few of them would be used and would not cause a world apocalypse. The danger of the nuclear destruction of a specific target and social ravages all around is much higher now than it was during the Cold War. Since for many people a limited nuclear war scenario or just one nuclear attack and its impact on society are difficult to imagine realistically, it is advisable to briefly describe such a situation. To illustrate a nuclear attack, I can give an idea of this risk by one reference. The publication The Aftermath of Nuclear Terrorism addresses the situation after a possible present-day nuclear attack. It is after a drop of classical nuclear weapon or at least use of briefcase nuclear or similar bomb in a major city. The hypothesis in the book considers the minor explosion of 15 kiloton bomb, in other words, of the same strength as that dropped on Hiroshima. Now it's considered a small nuclear weapon. The number of victims would be at least over 100,000, but probably 1 or 2 or 3 million. Radiation would make the city uninhabitable. The electromagnetic pulse would disable all electric equipment in the city. A collapse of the local economic and administrative system would endanger the lives of millions of people in the city and its surroundings, and of tens of millions in the country. The damage would grow to hundreds of billions of dollars. World stock exchanges would be seriously affected, and the Western world would be temporarily paralyzed if it would happen in the West. If a nuclear weapon were used, the administration of the attack state need not necessarily even know who had attacked. Countries suspected of the attack could deny involvement and would express their regrets in order to prevent retaliation using nuclear or conventional weapons and the certain serious damages of their regime, and perhaps even their whole country. In many parts of the world, people would wait for a response and potential nuclear retaliation. However, such a situation could, of course, represent a worse threat, a possible escalation with more nuclear attacks, and then a possible widespread nuclear war on the global scale. People in the world would be shocked by the use of nuclear weapons, and the world would be seized by a fear of a catastrophic global scenario. People are not prepared at all for the risk of nuclear warfare, nor for other similar risks, and most of social scientists are not exceptions to this. And this is the case whether this war were started by someone else and the United States were only to retaliate, or if the United States administration were to start this limited nuclear war itself. So let's ask, what precisely do the US political and military leaders now plan to do in their strategic plans concerning this issue? The relevant document which can explain the main strategic trends in this respect is the National Security Strategy, which was being issued since Ronald Reagan submitted the first one in 1987. In his first strategy announced at the Ronald Reagan Building in December 2017, President Donald Trump specified an application of his America First mindset to security issues. He has wanted to be contrasted with what he saw as Obama's appeasement and defeatism. The strategy identified two major nuclear powers, namely Russia and China, as revisionist powers, which are trying to shape a world antithetical to the US values and interests. The document gives these two countries key global significance, mentioning them many times. It refers to China 33 times and Russia 26 times. I quote, "Three main sets of challengers, the revisionist powers of China and Russia, the RAC states of Iraq and Iran and North Korea, and transnational threat organizations, particularly jihadist terrorist groups, are actively competing against the United States and our allies and partners." End quote. While the US is described here implicitly as a declining power in respect of its ability to maintain a leading role in the world, China and Russia are explicitly portrayed as rising powers, expanding their influence particularly through economic and political cooperation with many nations. The main geopolitical concept behind this is the idea of a contrast between unipolar and multipolar worlds. Specifically Russia in its European and Asian circles, and China, mainly in the Indo-Pacific regions, are considered rivals to the US. On the other hand, this strategy sees another nuclear power, India, as an important strategic and defense partner. For the US, this global power is expected to play a balancing role against China and Russia in Asia. The strategy also mentions two other potential nuclear powers as challenges and calls them dictatorships. I mentioned them, Iran and North Korea. However, here the US needs China for the dispute over nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. All the countries mentioned, together with transnational terrorist groups, allegedly attempt to erode US prosperity and security. The strategy sees these countries as fundamental contests, not only in the international sphere, but also in respect of differences between US values and the values of oppression and the enforcement of social uniformity. In order to face the challenge, it plans significant investment in nuclear weapons and devices. Calling for significant investment under the current conditions is a serious danger, especially taken into consideration that the United States have the biggest military budget in the world, more than 600 billion US dollars, a larger one than the budgets of the 8 other countries combined, with the largest military budgets. The 2018 edition of the Nuclear Posture Review offers a detailed specification of this plan for nuclear weapons. I tried to show some details here. Made in contrast to Barack Obama's 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, which followed the spirit of his anti-nuclear speech in Prague in 2009. By pursuing small nuclear weapons, the new 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, prepared by Donald Trump, retains not only business as usual, but it opens a new groundbreaking epoch in political and military actions with an intention to make limited nuclear attacks or war a reality. I have already mentioned that this US bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was mainly a dramatic escalation of the research application of nuclear power in the end of the World War II. It means the first US test of nuclear weapons and not part of the real military strategy. Later, both the Warsaw Pact and NATO countries created not only large nuclear weapons, but also small tactical ones in the form of short-range missiles and free-fall bombs, it means without a guidance system. But these were only part of much larger global military deterrent projects with major strategic nuclear weapons. The smaller weapons did not play an autonomous role. And when they were considered by various nuclear nation-states in regional relations after 1989, they were also regarded a part of deterrence. However, the new US Nuclear Posture Review is not limited to problems in the US borders or problems linked to the threat of the very existence of the state or the federal state, but it has geopolitical intentions beyond its borders. Trump wants a new mix of nuclear weapons, including small nuclear weapons, which can be used separately and individually without extending to large military conflicts. It makes the danger of their use much more probable because they are not so disastrous. Nevertheless, it is important to know what smaller nuclear weapons mean. I already mentioned that what is usually meant is that they can destroy all humans and things within a 1-mile radius and seriously disrupt society in much larger circle around. This kind of tactical weapon is already in the US arsenal, and Trump wants to produce more low-yield weapons and options. Now such a bomb is considered usable in various battles and independently of the cooperating countries. attempts to initiate a discussion on the autonomous use of small nuclear weapons without their inclusion in large military programs using major nuclear weapons developed especially thanks to new technologies, allowing also more precise mutual control of activities of rivals. Developed electronic systems, including global communications with big data, the Internet of Things, advanced high-precise military systems, etc., make the business use of nuclear weapons possible on a limited scale, which would potentially not extend into total global war. While recently military, corporate and political agents had started to revive the possibility of the use of this kind of weapons, the inauguration of Donald Trump has brought thinking the unthinkable quickly and in the chaotic way into play. Mainly since, as I mentioned, in December 2017 and January 2018, when the main documents were published on them. Conceptually taken, technology, profit and power interests and current politics have constructed the preconditions, conditions and application respectively. Now I would like to focus on the second part of my lecture, and it's a critique of technological reason or rationality, focusing especially on Adorno's and Horkheimer's dialectics of enlightenment. But first I would like to mention contrast a bit, a comparison of John Rawls, what he wrote in his paper called 50 Years After Hiroshima. It was his paper focusing on that when there was the anniversary of bombing Hiroshima, and he suggested what to do in order to avoid the next nuclear usage, the nuclear war or nuclear bombing. And I agree with him when he says, I believe that both the firebombing of Japanese cities beginning in the spring of 1945 and the later atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th were great wrongs and rightly seen as such. It's the quotation. It was not under any special situation, under the exemption of extreme crisis, which was considered by Rawls, for example, when British bombed Hamburg and Berlin earlier before Stalingrad. Then John Rawls says that it's possible in exceptional situations to make these things like, let's say, massive bombing of some cities. But it was not the case of usage of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki from his point of view. And his solution to avoid the nuclear war is to arrange principles, to define principles used in bello of democratic peoples. So it means principles governing the conduct of war. And he says something about the just and lasting peace between peoples, that democratic states don't fight against other democratic states and so on. And there are 6 normative principles, very shortly explained. And from his point of view, in a very general way, it's the way how to prevent the next nuclear war. But I'm a bit skeptical here, because I think that first of all, he didn't make any real analysis in cooperation with social sciences, and he didn't focus, in fact, on the main problems which are here. And I think that as a critical theorist, I have to first look at the critique of the people and the problems which are here. And then when I see what problems are there, and we see the description of the situation, we can see what normative solutions can be there and what are normative preconditions there. So I start from a critique, and I think that In this situation, when there is such a big danger of nuclear war for the first time in the human history, really, I think that we have to probably rethink a very skeptical point of view described by Adorno and Horkheimer in their Dialectics of Concrete. I think it's too skeptical, but still I think that we have to take into account what they wrote after the World War II. So the fact that the fact of the Second World War led Adorno and Horkheimer, especially in their joint work of the Dialectics of Enlightenment, from the ever-increasing rejection of the described development as distractive rationalization and technology, to the criticism of the unhopeful capitalist domination and cultural manipulation. Settlement of the totalitarian fascist system was considered only the outcome of enormous social development which was wrong since the beginning of the human civilization. As a consequence of expansive rationalization and related technological pathologies from the birth of our civilization 12,000 years ago to the present. This pervasive negativism, however, leads to hopelessness that could be, but is not in their text, supplemented by at least fundamental reflection on potential social transformation. The consequences of technological rationality, which especially since the beginning of modern times have a strong impact on our lives, are a challenge which cannot be ignored and overcome. Adorno and Horkheimer's attention is focused on the long-term historical causes of the development of capitalism. They focus primarily on the overall critique of Western civilization in relation to the determining role of the negative aspects of instrumental reason. Their interpretation sees the source of pathological development from the antiquity to the present, concerning the negative moments of rational disposal of natural processes. This kind of disposition is instrumental to the control of external and internal nature, and consequently the formation of the relations of social domination. Both authors criticize the radicalization of technological reason, but its roots don't extend only to the 18th century Enlightenment, but to the antiquity, as it's well known. From this perspective, the Enlightenment accompanies the whole of human history. People's endeavor to survive and deal with the traps of nature have led to the instrumentalization of human reason since the beginning of Western civilization. And a result of this approach and the formation of the contrast between nature and culture, there were three types of nature control. First, the control of the external nature. It means the surrounding nature in which one moves, the human beings move, the outer world surrounding us. Second, the control of the inner nature. It means the instinct life, the nature of a human being. And thirdly, in connection with the second kind of control, it is not only control of herself or himself, but also control one another, one human being controlling another human being. Horkheimer and Adorno explain the problem of instrumental rationality and find it already in the canonical text of Western civilization at Homer. The development of instrumental rationality from then to the present has positive, but above all negative aspects. The basis of the developmental dialectics or the foundation of Western civilization is denial of nature in general, internal and external, and the spreading perverse irrationality. This is a paradox because the outer nature began to be dominated by the liberation of a human being who is disciplined and enslaved. There is an extension of technical rationality and its self-serving development when it forgets its own only a mediating role and suppresses the original purpose it should serve. Its development paradoxically becomes a brake on the development of the human beings. The evolutionary dialectic of the Enlightenment has, over time, become the dialectic of capitalism and a fact with long-lasting historical implications. The economic crisis before the World War II and the subsequent Nazism and fascism are just the culmination of the long-term development, which in the prehistoric period of human development includes the transformation of means into purpose. And I will just conclude this part of my paper by saying, following this analysis, we can identify the problem of one-sided exploitation and misuse of instrumental rationality that comes from human history from the beginning, not only in repressive systems, but often also implicitly reproduced in opposition to these repressive systems. Problems of instrumental rationality can exist both in capitalism and in attempts to overcome it, as experienced also in the former Soviet bloc countries. Instrumental rationality can be used positively, but it should not be the main principle of action, and otherwise it becomes a problematic assumption on which different authoritarian, non-participatory systems can be established. However, the fundamental thesis is that long-term technological development, which brings about the expansion of instrumental rationality, is not directly and consciously shaped by individuals and collectives, and that the possibilities of its correction are very difficult. Adorno and Horkheimer's interpretation of criticism of instrumental rationality may seem also one-sided and inappropriate, because it does not allow to cross the given situation. There is almost no room for at least partial free action against negative tendencies of instrumental rationality in their historical development. But on the other hand, the skeptical position of both authors does not even allow to think of such a possibility of critical correction. The definition of their position can be done by refusing to resign and trying to carry out meaningful activities that would allow, let's say, intersubjective development and cultivation of mutual recognition among people, even if it is in the background of technological development, which at least in the 20th century resulted in civilizational regression several times. Due to the fact that the various cultures of the human civilization come into contact with each other in the present era, global era, and the development of human civilization is indeed becoming a full planetary one, the hypertrophy of the pathological aspects of instrumental rationality in the historical development can cause the collapse of the whole human civilization. For this reason, the dangers of global technological development need to be seen as a powerful motive for other analyses, which may seem more promising, but even if there are these non-answered issues of pathologies of technological development. So it's a big warning, but probably too skeptical, but still I think we have to rethink it. Okay. So now, maybe I will. So now a third part, another part of my paper. This is just, you can read the correction, but I will move already to the third part of my paper. It is necessary to understand the motivation and action for why the US administration is present in military documents on the actual use of the weapons of limited nuclear war. The reason is given in the mass media why the US plans actual use of nuclear weapons in wars, and they say it's unorthodox trap. But I want to show that there is bigger structural problem, and it is interconnected with the private corporate military sector and so on. So there are deeper roots of the problem. In order to understand this better, we have to understand various groups of transnational capitalism. First, transnational corporate group, which contains mainly owners and big corporations and also hired corporate managers. Second, we can see that there is a political group which comprises politicians and bureaucrats who often serve corporate owners and managers and share profit as well. While politicians and state administration are expected to serve citizens and democracies, they serve the corporate sector and only partially citizens in oligarchic systems or systems with oligarchic tendencies. And then there is a technical group which comprises professional experts who hold a highly evaluated specific knowledge and so on. There are also other groups, but I will not mention that. What is important is that we see that in the US administration there is a conflict of democratic interests of these groups. And in democratic societies, you cannot be part of all of them. It's a conflict of interest and it's against law. But now what's happening in the US is that there is a big clash of these interests. As the exemplary case of Secretary of Defense James Mattis, he's really an he's in excessive clash of interest because he overlaps three groups of transnational capitalism, as I explained it. First, he's part of political group, he's the Minister of Defense, but this political role, which is expected by citizens to pursue democracy, is in conflict with his second role in the technical military group. This is the reason why he needed a waiver by the US Senate, because US federal law specifies the 7-year period away for retired army personnel before becoming defense secretary. He didn't satisfy this condition. And he's also part of the third corporate group. After he retired as a general, he became one of directors of General Dynamics Corporation, which is one of the main contractors to the Department of Defense of the US and received billions of US dollars in contracts. General Dynamics provides many services, including combat systems, marine systems, munitions and armaments, information system, etc. It is highly significant that it has been one of manufacturers of nuclear weapons. Specifically, it has been part of support for Trident II nuclear missiles used by the USA and the UK, particularly by the US, until 2042. The company has also sold military personnel to other countries, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So the combination of membership in these three groups of transnational system makes the Defense Secretary Mattis a problematic figure, and he's not alone in the administration who is under question because of conflict of interests. We can see that Department of Defense, as for the Department of Defense, the Defense Secretary is only the tip of the iceberg. According to the US Government Accountability Office, employees who worked in the ministry are massively employed in the private military sector, and it's a high risk also from the long-term perspective. For example, in 2006, 52 major defense contractors employed 86,000 former military and civilian personnel who work in the Ministry of Defense, more than 80,000 people. And of course, these people transfer the knowledge from Ministry of Defense to private companies who earn money and get profit from state activities. And 65% of them were employed by 7 of the contractors. So you see the big clash of interests here, and this is a real problem because it's from profit making. And I will go to the conclusion now. The situation is really serious, and this is not an exaggeration because we cannot eliminate the possibility of global escalation of a local, limited nuclear war. In the end of my paper, I would like just to mention warning of the bulletin of the atomic scientists, including 15 Nobel laureates on its board. The bulletin, founded by veterans of the Manhattan Project, worried about the negative consequences of their research on nuclear issues and has served as a well-known indicator of the seriousness of their research on nuclear issues. And so on. I will be quick. Their doomsday clock has worsened since last year, and it is now only 2 minutes from the apocalypse. According to the clock, it's a symbolic clock, it is the most dangerous situation since 1953. The last time a similar situation was described was in the Cold War confrontation between Joseph Stalin and Henry Truman, when fears reached their highest level. And although the hypothesis for nuclear war, be it limited or global, may be questioned, one can also point out that in the long history of human civilization over the last 12,000 years, people has been using its ever more advanced technological capacity and abusing it in wars of ever-increasing scope. One may wonder whether there is any reason to assume that we are in this respect in a historically unique situation at the very end of history, when people will never use its advanced technology to exploit the most extensive of wars, this time nuclear war. Even if history doesn't give us a positive answer, this should not prevent us from attempting to limit the danger and possible damage of as much as possible. And the last slide, there are concluding questions which I opened as agenda setting, and I didn't answer that too much. And they are, to what extent we can resist pathological aspects of instrumental rationality in the historical development. Can we really avoid nuclear war, or is it just a question of time when nuclear powers will be used, as Adorno and Horkheimer explained in their book? But I think that still we can be somehow active, at least a little. And I think that we can reach a separation of powers and to avoid the worst clash of political, corporate and military interests now. But still, can we really avoid this situation systematically in the system of global capitalism? So these are questions I wanted to present in my paper. Thank you very much for your attention.
Now we have some time for questions. Professor Itamar.
Thank you, Marek, for this very interesting presentation. I was just curious to know what you make of Donald Trump's getting closer to Russia in keeping these trade wars with China, given the geopolitical chessboard. Because the way you presented, the actions mainly from U.S. administration. Of course, you didn't have the time to go into other superpowers or other major players on the geopolitical scenario. but I was particularly interested in the way you were trying to come up with an alternative to John Rawls' realistic utopian approach, right? So I was wondering how you respond to your own diagnosis of the realpolitik today.
Okay, thank you, Nita. Concerning other powers, they don't prepare a usage of nuclear powers, nuclear weapons now. You know, as I mentioned, in the past, all of the countries wanted to produce nuclear weapons only as deterrents. They never wanted to use it, in fact. And if they started to think about that, it was refused in all the states. But this is for the first time when one country really wants to use nuclear weapons, because technologies are so developed that it's possible to make not a global catastrophe, but just to make a local catastrophe. Just several million people can die. And it's acceptable for the US administration now. So if we analyze other countries, we don't see such tendencies like in the US. That's why I focused on the US. And other countries have still the previous approach to the problem, the nuclear weapons. Second, you ask what is my answer? I just wanted to show that even if probably maybe we have to rethink dialectics of enlightenment again in this really bad situation when nuclear war can be a reality. And maybe it's just a question of time, because human beings always used the most advanced weapons. So maybe we can't avoid it, but still we can do something. So I tried to see what is the biggest problem, where is the source of motivation of some people to make limited nuclear war. And I saw that it is in the clash of interests between political, potentially democratic interests on the one side, and military technical interests and corporate interests on the other side. And as I said, it didn't happen for many, many decades since the World War II, just once after the World War II. It happened during the time of the World War II when there was a waiver for special US military personnel to go to the important political position after he was in the military. So it's really a unique situation now, but it's even more unique because Secretary of Defense is really heavily interlinked with the corporate business. And I just gave one example, which is most visible, but I also mentioned many other cases, 80,000 ex-employees of Ministry of Defense who are now in the business, military business. And some people were already arrested and they are in jail because their interest clashed too much. So I think that we can, even if we revitalize that skeptical point of view and we see pathological historical tendencies of instrumental rationality which can prevail in the future, and nuclear weapons and other weapons will be used, still we can at least limit it and sometimes avoid it. Not always, probably, in the future. And I think that when we focus on the main problem, it's a clash of interests within global capitalism. And I think that if we criticize it and people are against that, that clash, the most serious clashes, can be avoided many times. So there is a normative presupposition which is in a separation of powers and avoiding a clash of interests. And I think that when we are in such a serious global situation, it's not enough just to say, okay, let's speculate about some normative principles which can be good for conduct of war, I think that if the situation is so serious now, we have to see really the cause of the problem and to avoid it as quickly as possible. Otherwise, it will be too late. So I don't think that this solution I offered in my critical analysis and in its normative presupposition works all the time. That's why I say that probably we have to revitalize thinking about Adorno's and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment. Not totally as they did. I would do it with more space for free action, but still I think that it's serious there.
Thank you, Marek. I have also two questions close to what Mittermeier said. I mean, one on your diagnosis, so to say, and one on your use of Horkheimer's and Adorno. The first, while I agree completely with you that we have a clash of interest, we saw this in the George W. Bush administration with Dick Cheney and most of the people in the government worked for corporations who made a lot of money in the Iraqi war or in the aftermath with the reconstruction. So you don't need actually, this is something that has already happened before. Well, yes and no. I mean, on another level, it was not only about a weapon. It was mostly about exploiting oil fields or other natural resources. So the point with my diagnosis would be first, with your diagnosis, sorry. Do you really think that that the MAD doctrine is still not valid? Because if you look at the countries that Trump mentioned, he will never, would be met to try to attack China or Russia because they could react. So the risk of a reaction is there. The same goes for North Korea and Iran in the sense that they don't know. So they are not sure whether this country has or not nuclear weapons. So that's why they are being. So the point is against which enemies they could use nuclear weapons. So that would be my point, because in the documents that you mentioned, well, of course, jihadi terrorists, but what do? Do you bomb central Afghanistan? That could be a possibility. But down to the philosophical part, I'm not sure whether you need to share Adorno's and Horkheimer's view of technologies, of human technologies. Because in this case, you could also come with a more Rawlsian and normative approach and say, look, what we have here is a malfunctioning of democratic institutions. So what you should actually do is not so much doing a social criticism or against the way in which we use technology, but a social criticism about the way in which this specific democracy is functioning. So a democracy which, on the one side, allows for this clash of interests, but on the other side, and I find this interesting, it is quite transparent. So the documents that you were quoting, they're out. I mean, it's the US government itself that is saying we have a problem here. So something in this democracy is still working. And this maybe allow for imagining a criticism, an imitative criticism of this democracy. Otherwise, we will have this kind of total domination, and we have really no room for saying, but what do we do? So, do you still see hope maybe in a working democracy? I mean, this is the difference between Obama and Trump, basically.
Of course, thank you for your question, Alessandro. The first one, you think that there is a problem if some other countries like Russia or China would retaliate and it would kill several millions of the US citizens. But that's not a problem now. It's considered as acceptable cost. So yes, because they think that, in the past, when there were not precise technologies, the US or Russia would start the war, and each part would start to send, let's say, 100 nuclear weapons. It would be the global catastrophe. But now, because of high precise technologies, We know what our enemies do. So you can send only 1, 2, 3 weapons, that's it. 1, 2, 3 bombs. You kill 1 or 2, 3 million people there. They kill 1, 2, 3 million people in your country, that's it. Just a limited nuclear war, and it's accepted now. It's accepted. Concerning specific countries, of course it's not necessary to kill people in Beijing, for example. But you know, there is a dispute in South China Sea. So you can put nuclear bomb in South China Sea or the one of provincial cities to make the use of these nuclear weapons. Of course, Russia has also some interest. Maybe you can attack Syria. Donald Trump already said that he doesn't want to attack Iran directly, but he said, I would let Israel do what's necessary. So, of course, Israel has weapons, nuclear weapons from the US. They can do it. So, or some other disputed territories between Pakistan and India. So now, because of precise weapons, nuclear weapons started to be usable. In the past, it would be global catastrophe, global apocalypse. But now they are normal weapons. So they will be probably used. And that's why I talk about the dialectics of enlightenment, that there is the pathological tendency of technological rationality, and probably we can't avoid the usage of the most developed weapons, including nuclear weapons. Maybe it's just a question of time, as I said. So when it's acceptable now for the US, if I read various analyses and they say that, okay, so then 1 or 2, 3 millions of the people would be killed in the US, and that's still acceptable. Second question, more philosophical. I don't think that the Rawlsian approach of normative concept of democracy can solve it. First of all, there is the problem that Rawls doesn't want to be connected to the social sciences. Since the second edition of Theory of Justice, he said that it's just free thinking. So he can't analyze the problems we have. And he doesn't analyze global capitalism at all. He doesn't analyze various groups of global capitalism and their clashes. He's not specific enough. He can't help us now. I rather follow, in this case, critical theorist Leslie Sclair from London University, LSE, who makes these analyses from the critical theory point of view, and I can share many normative, let's say, parts of Rawls's theory, but it's not specific enough, and many analyses are just missing there. So that's the problem. And this is my answer. So I would rather follow, let's say, the struggle for recognition on it, but specified for conditions of global capitalism, and to see various groups of the people within global capitalism, leading groups, and some groups which criticize them because of the clash of interests. This is, I think, the core which should be analyzed, and if we do it, and if there is protest, we can avoid the usage of nuclear weapons. But if we would try to look only at very abstract sentences about democracy, I think it's not specific enough to avoid this problem.
I want to thank again Professor Hrubec. Sorry, but we don't have time in order to keep the schedule. We must close now.